Hello friends and neighbors, and welcome to a movie review double feature, which may or may not become a thing.
Do you follow me?
Not really.
Fight in here. This is a
Shoot your eye out, kid.
Why is the run go serious?
To have been shot. I heard 2 shots, and the president fell.
Who's that guy? What's he doing?
Like his security.
Okay, fine. Stay with that guy. Everyone else, give me Ashton. 3, stick with the president. Just stay with him. That's good. Just stay with him. Stay with him. Hold it there. This is insane.
In this review, I'll be taking a look at 2 similar movies, a classic film that had great influence on the genre of storytelling, and a more recent film that benefited from that influence. So let's get started by first looking at our classic film, Rashomon. As has been pointed out to me in the past, great films are not limited to AFI's Top 100 list, or even American films. And our first film today comes from acclaimed Japanese director Akira Kurosawa, which I'm sure I'm pronouncing extremely well. I apologize, iJethRobot, and everyone else who actually speaks Japanese. The film came out in 1950, and you might not be immediately familiar with the title, but once I start to describe it, it might start to sound a little familiar to you. This classic film tells the story of a rape and murder from the point of view of 4 different people who witnessed it. However, the 4 stories that they tell don't quite mesh, as many of the major details are completely different. The film takes us through each of the 4 stories, looking at it from each person's perspective. As you can imagine, each person tells the story in such a way so as to paint themselves in the most positive light, and by the end of the film, we don't know who, if anyone, is telling the truth or what really happened. Does that sound familiar? It should, because it's a technique that's been used in dozens of stories since. Granted, many of these are television shows, and many of them are actually spoofs, but still it's been used often, so often in fact that it actually has its own name, the Rashomon effect. All in the Family, Star Trek The Next Generation, Batman the Animated Series, Happy Days, MASH, even Garfield and Friends have all used this technique. So why does this technique work, and why was it so influential? Well, like any good idea, it's partly due to the idea itself, and partly due to how it was carried out. There are 3 principal people involved in this crime: the bandit who is accused of committing the crime, the woman who was raped, and the man who was murdered. And one other person also witnessed the event, though he was not directly involved. All 4 of them tell their version of the story. The dead man tells it through a medium, but we don't just hear their words, we actually see the events happening as they saw it. In that way, the movie shows us the event as it exists in the memories of the characters. And really, there's not a whole dialogue in this movie. Kurosawa was greatly influenced by silent films, and it really shows in this picture. Most of the story is told with just visuals, especially in the storytelling sections. But because of the way the story is presented, each of these actors isn't just playing himself or herself, he is playing himself or herself as each of the other characters viewed that person. So the bandit, for example, is playing himself as he is viewed by the woman, himself as he is viewed by the samurai, himself as he is viewed by the woodcutter, and himself as he is viewed by himself. Because each storyteller is trying to paint himself in the best possible light, and so the actions and motivations are a little different for each character. So they are, each of them, essentially playing 4 or 5 different characters. For example, in 2 of the stories, the samurai and the bandit fight each other to the death. The way the bandit tells the story of the fight is a skilled and honorable one, containing, by the way, some of the best fight choreography I've ever seen in a movie. The woodcutter, who is supposedly the objective voice, also tells the story of a fight, but in his case, the fight is a little different. It's fearful, almost cowardly, and not the least bit skillful or honorable. It looks more like a couple of kids fighting each other on the playground than an actual skilled battle. And that doesn't even get into the brilliant cinematography, the use of light, and the sheer simplicity of the direction. The movie is well put together, and besides that, the idea itself is fascinating. Did these characters outright lie about what they saw, or do they just remember the series of events differently? Well, it's probably probably a little bit of both. They each try to make themselves look the most honorable, when in reality none of them is entirely honorable. Even the woodcutter, who was supposedly the most objective and truthful point of view, was hiding something. And while some of the lies are probably premeditated, many of the lies are probably just the characters remembering things differently. So like Memento, we can see how unreliable and often self-serving memory can be. I also like that they portray both the cynical side of this, human nature is inherently evil and dishonest, and the hopeful side of this, human nature is inherently good and this is just one flaw in it. It's all very well done, and it's easy to see why this movie became as influential as it did. There's also the fact that we never learn exactly what happened in the woods. The woodcutter's version of the story is the most reliable, but even that one isn't entirely truthful. And in most of the later stories that use the Rashomon effect, we eventually learn what actually happened. In fact, oftentimes the different viewpoints are actually used to reveal the truth. But in the actual Rashomon, the opposite effect is achieved. The different stories actually obscure the truth, and in the end, we don't really know what happened. But that's not really the point of the story. We're not supposed to learn the truth. We're supposed to learn more about human nature and how we remember and relay things. This makes the movie even greater because it doesn't cheapen itself by taking the easy way out. It leaves us with unanswered questions. Which leads us to our second film, a movie that used the Rashomon effect in its storytelling, Vantage Point, released in 2008 and starring Dennis Quaid, Matthew Fox, Forrest Whitaker, William Hurt, and Sigourney Weaver. Though a box office success, it received a lot of negative reviews, many critics specifically citing the movie's use of the Rashomon technique and comparing it unfavorably to the original movie. In this story, we have the viewpoints of 8 different people, witnessing the apparent assassination of the president as well as the subsequent bombing of the peace summit that he was attending. Just like in Rashomon, we get each viewpoint individually. We start with seemingly the most objective viewpoint, the news trailer for the network that's covering this whole story, and then with each restart of the story, we delve a little bit deeper into what went on behind the scenes, until by the last restart of the story we know exactly what went on, much like most of the modern day stories that use the Rashomon effect. Take that aspect out of it and it's pretty much just your standard thriller. You've got the tortured Secret Service agent, the rogue Secret Service agent, the morally gray cop, the terrorists, etc, etc, etc. The only characters I do find kind of interesting are the tourist with the camera and Sigourney Weaver's news director, just because I think they're the most like real people. Everyone else is just kind of meh, and the story is pretty standard as well. By the end it pretty much just devolves into the typical car chase, which I'll admit does go on for a little too long. That being said though, does it really deserve the harsh criticism that it got? I mean, it's not a great film, but it's not that bad. Is it really fair to compare it to Rashomon like this? Well, obviously Rashomon is the superior film. It's making a philosophical statement on the nature of human memory and deception, and the plot is just incidental, whereas with Vantage Point, it's a plot-driven thriller with an interesting style of storytelling. And not even a terribly original one. But to be fair, that's all it's trying to be. I don't think the makers of Vantage Point were setting out to make the next Rashomon. I think they were setting out to make an exciting thriller with an interesting, though unoriginal, style of storytelling. I also think it's important to note that despite the similar storytelling styles, the two movies really don't have that much in common. First of all, the viewpoints in Vantage Point are much more objective. We're not looking at how each person remembers each of these events, we're looking at how they saw them, their vantage point. So the sequence of events doesn't change depending on whose eyes we're looking at it through. As such, it's much easier to find out what really happened because we're essentially just going deeper and deeper behind the scenes. That's basically how this movie creates suspense, and by the end we know everything that happened, and the only questions we have are mostly plot hole related. In that way, the objective of the film is entirely different from Rashomon, which wasn't looking to reveal the truth so much as look at how we obscure it. And while that does make it more complex, and like I said earlier, the better film, Vantage Point is still an effective thriller. It's nothing special, but it kept me engaged and entertained, which is basically what thrillers are designed to do. And really, when you look at the different stories that have used the Rashomon effect in their storytelling, they use it for the same reason, to reveal the truth rather than obscure it. In the Rugrats episode The Trial, it's only after Tommy realizes that the stories Angelica made up earlier means that she was in the room the whole time that it's revealed that she's the one who committed the crime. One episode of Star Trek The Next Generation actually pays homage to Rashomon by having 4 very similar perspectives in a similar crime. But again, they use the testimonies to find out the truth at the end. And if the technique isn't being used for this purpose, it's being used for comedic effect, so that we can watch the characters that we've gotten to know act in ways that are completely contrary to the character that's been set up. In the MASH episode, The Novocaine Mutiny, when Frank Burns tells his version of the story, It's completely ludicrous, and we know that it's completely ludicrous because the characters are acting in ways completely contrary to the ways that we know that they act. But then when Hawkeye tells his version of the story, which is what actually happened by all indications, it's more believable. In the Garfield and Friends episode Twice Told Tale, Garfield and John both tell their versions of how the house got to be filled with yogurt, don't ask, both blaming the other character, painting him as completely unreasonable and deranged, and himself as saintly and innocent. Strangely enough though, I think that this version actually comes pretty close to achieving the Rashomon effect just because we never find out what actually happened. I mean, okay, it's not nearly as subtle of course, but it's Garfield and Friends. All of this is to say that while Vantage Point might not be as great as Rashomon, that's okay. For what it is, it's pretty decent, and I'd give it a worth borrowing. Rashomon, on the other hand, is a must-see for anyone who enjoys the Rashomon effect, and I give it a worth owning. Go see this movie and see how the original effect was truly done. And that's all from this movie review double feature. I'm the Mad Hatter, and until next time... Hey! Hey! It's my hat! What the hell's going on? Where's Editing Matt? What are you doing here? Editing Matt told me to. He had to go take care of something. He told me to take over it, and now some lunatic stolen my hat. How am I supposed to look intimidating like this? You weren't the only one that had a hat stolen. At least it wasn't stolen from your head. Hey, there's something wrong with Editing Matt. Come on, we need your help.